What is your best It's a Small World story? I was in Okinawa, Japan, when I decided to stop off at a video store run by an American expat. I was wearing a shirt featuring the name of an extremely small high school I'd attended in upstate New York. Think 200 students, village of 600 people. Expat, are you from village? Yeah, I graduated from school a few years ago. Expat, so did I. I was class of 1969 me. That's the year my mother graduated. Did you know Mom? Expat, yeah, we dated for a little bit. I used to work for your grandmother until I joined the Marines. Moral of the story, there's no escaping the small town. Ever.
That's a pretty wild encounter. Running into someone who dated your mom halfway around the world is something else. It's like that small-town connection really follows you wherever you go. Makes you realize how tight-knit those communities can be. All those years later, and you're still linked through family stories. Guess you can't really escape those roots, even in a place like Okinawa.
My grandfather is that super kind, talkative guy that makes friends with every person he meets. He visited Italy with my grandmother, and while walking down the street heard someone calling, Joe. Joe. Turns out it was someone he had met back home in NJ that just so happened to be vacationing in Italy as well, and was able to pick him out of a crowd.
That's pretty cool. It's wild how small the world can feel sometimes. Just running into someone you know while you're thousands of miles away. I can imagine my grandfather being super friendly and striking up a conversation right there. It's nice to see those connections happen. It probably made their trip even better, having a familiar face around.
Was at Disney World with my sister and brother-in-law. We started chatting with the couple next to us in line. Turns out the woman is from the same town that me and my sister grew up in. We'd never met or seen her before. And the man was from the same town that my brother-in-law grew up in. The real kicker is we grew up in New England and my brother-in-law is from a small town in Australia. What are the odds of two pairs of unrelated people from opposite sides of the world getting married and ending up standing next to each other at Disney World?
That's a wild coincidence. Just hanging out at Disney and running into people with those connections is pretty neat. It's funny how small the world can feel sometimes. Makes the whole trip more memorable, for sure. You go there for fun and then get these unexpected connections. Just goes to show, you never know who you might bump into.
Repost that got buried last time. My grandpa, who knew my granny when they were children, told me about how he'd cycle for hours to see her, and she'd get her friend/next-door neighbor to hang out with him instead. Then when they got too close, Granny realized what she was missing out on and chased her friend off, reclaiming him. They were together for another 70 years or so. Anyway, I told this story to one of my best friends, whom I met at university, nowhere near where either of our families came from, mentioning the name of this other woman. There was an incredulous pause, and then she says, "But that's my grandma. You've met her." After confirming a few details, we realized she was the right woman, and talked to her and found she still remembered songs my grandpa had sung to her. We exchanged details for our grandmothers, and they chatted on the phone for the first time in decades, both in their late 80s. TLDR University housemate and I discovered our grandmothers were best friends in childhood.
That's interesting how things can connect like that. Your grandpas were close back in the day, and now you found out your friend's grandma was part of that history. It's nice to see those old memories resurface. It must have been a cool moment for both grandmothers to catch up. Sometimes you can't help but appreciate how small the world really is.
Left the US to travel Europe when I was young. Stayed for a while on a small island in Greece. Eventually ran in my neighbor, literally the girl next door. We both couldn't believe it. Ended up having a great night catching up. Eventually lost her to this suave Italian guy. Can't really blame her. You don't go to Europe to fuck your neighbor's...
That's a wild coincidence. Running into someone from home in another country can be really surprising. It sounds like you had a good time reconnecting, even if it didn't last. I guess adventures in Europe sometimes lead to unexpected outcomes. You never know who you'll meet or what will happen. Life just has its funny moments.
My mum is from Melbourne, Australia. My dad is from the west coast of Ireland. A few years ago, my mum decided to look into her ancestry, since she knew her relatives were from Ireland. Turns out her family 8 generations ago, before they moved to Australia, were neighbors of my father's family, who have lived in the same place for the last 8 generations. It really is a small world, even when it seemed infinitely large that long ago, tongue sticking out.
That's a nice coincidence. It's interesting how family histories can overlap like that. Having relatives who lived so close together generations ago really shows how connected everyone can be, even across continents. Makes you think about how many stories are just waiting to be discovered. Family roots can surprise you sometimes.
When I was a freshman in high school, we were doing the typical icebreaker, everyone giving their fun fact. One guy says that when he was preschool age, he lived in Singapore due to his dad's job. Another kid says, wait, me too. Turns out 10 years later, 2 preschool best friends living with their expatriate parents ended up in the same math class in suburban Philadelphia.
That's a pretty cool coincidence. It's funny how life works sometimes, connecting people from different parts of the world. They probably had all these shared memories but never realized it until that moment. It must have been nice for them to reconnect after all those years. Makes you think about all the unseen ties between people.
My sister mentioned her friend said that her mom's company was hiring for a job I have 10 years experience with in a state 1,000 miles away from me. I applied, sent the friend's mom my resume, and waited for a reply. She replied that she sent my resume onto the hiring manager. She then asked if I remember the hiring manager. We graduated college from the same school, with the same major, in the same organization, and at the same time. I have an interview on Monday.
That's a pretty interesting situation. It's wild how connections work out like that. You apply for what seems like a random job, and then it turns out you have a shared history with the hiring manager. Definitely adds a layer of familiarity. Good luck with the interview on Monday. Should be a good opportunity for you.
I posted this before, but here goes. A girl I went to school with moved to Singapore from Scotland. I hadn't seen her for a few years since she moved. A couple of years later, my mate moved from Scotland to Perth, Australia, and I was going over for a few weeks to visit. So I fly from Glasgow to Dubai and then on to Perth. There I am waiting in immigration in Perth, and I bump into the girl who moved to Singapore. I go outside and meet my mate who was waiting on me, and he was speaking to her too. They were in class together back in Scotland.
That's a cool coincidence. Running into someone you know halfway across the world is pretty rare. It's funny how paths cross like that, especially in a place like Perth, far from home. The world feels smaller when that happens. It must have been nice for both of you to reconnect and share stories. Makes traveling even more interesting when you see familiar faces in unexpected places.
Me and my mom live in Canada, moved from Germany. I was born their mom born in Russia. We went for vacation to Mexico 3 years ago. We saw an ad about swimming with dolphins, and me and her went like, fuck yeah, we were doing that. We get to the place, change into our swim gear, and buy the tickets for the event, and walk the narrow walkway towards the pool with the dolphin. This woman coming from the pool walks towards us and passes us. My mom suddenly recognized her and screams, "Natalia!" Woman turns around and screams my mom's name. So it turns out we just met my mom's best friend from elementary school in Russia. Natalia randomly moved away when my mom was a child and lost contact completely. We ended up not going to the pool for like half an hour because they had to catch up on life stories and exchange contact info. TL, Dr. Mom met long-lost childhood friend at a dolphin swimming place in Mexico.
That's a nice story. It's funny how life works sometimes. Just a trip to swim with dolphins and you run into someone from your mom's past. I guess that's what vacations are for, unexpected reunions. They probably had a lot to talk about after so many years. Must have been cool to see that connection. Sometimes you just have to slow down and enjoy those moments, even if dolphins are waiting.
Went to the cemetery to visit my grandfather for the first time since the funeral. We couldn't find a grave marker, so we went to the office to ask where he is. When we told the woman in the office his name, she said she knew someone who spelt their name the same way. It turns out he was a security guard for a company. She was the receptionist at 60 years ago. She thought he was cute.
It's interesting how small the world can be. You go to visit a loved one, and suddenly you find connections you'd never expect. That woman probably has a lot of stories from her past, and it's funny to think about how people's lives intersect in unexpected ways. Just a reminder that memories can carry on through others, even in places like a cemetery.
One of my best friends is someone I met on Halo 3. We met online through some mutual friend, and we eventually started to play together all the time. After at least a year of playing with each other, I heard him say Oakbrook, which is a neighborhood a few miles from where I live, and I had a lot of friends who live there, so I was very familiar with the place. I asked him if it was the same Oakbrook that I knew, and sure enough it was. Later that week, I drove to his place, and thus our friendship began.
It's cool how gaming can connect people. I also had a similar experience online, playing with someone for months before realizing we lived in the same city. We decided to meet up, and it turned out to be a good decision. It's nice when virtual friendships turn into real-life ones. Makes you appreciate the internet a bit more. You never know who you might meet.
I can start. Went to Brazil on charter holiday. Met this guy in the pool. Turns out he is from my hometown and had met my father a week earlier when my father transported him in an ambulance. 6 months later, I met this guy's stepdaughter on a nightclub in my hometown. Went on skiing vacation with my parents to a location 1,000 kilometers from my hometown. Met an old girlfriend on a nightclub that I had not seen for many, many years. Had a one-night stand, including breakfast with my parents. Edit, I almost forgot. I was working in a call center with IT support for a couple of months in another part of the country. A guy calls on behalf of his company, ordering new parts for computers. At the end of the call, when he stated his name, I realized it was my next cousin calling. He did not know that I was working there.
That's a pretty wild set of coincidences. Makes you think about how small the world is. The Brazil story is interesting, especially meeting someone connected to your dad. The skiing trip mishap is another level too, running into an old flame like that. And the call center call? That's just bizarre, but in a good way. Family ties pop up when you least expect them. Life has its funny connections.
Short version. WoW was in its peak at the time, around 12 million players. Had a long-term guildmate and friend on WoW. Went to a music festival and hung out with a bunch of strangers who camped next to us about a month after the festival. I started talking to my guildmate about my time at the festival. He recognized particular details about my story. Turns out he was one of the guys I was drinking with. We met up the next year, and sure enough, it was him.
That's a pretty cool coincidence. It's funny how gaming brings people together in unexpected ways. You hang out with random people at a festival, and later find out one of them is someone you've been playing with for years. That kinda makes the gaming community feel more connected, you know? Meeting in real life must have made the friendship even stronger. Just goes to show how small the world can be sometimes.
When I was about 11, I went on a cruise where I made a friend, Curtis. We never spoke after that, but we were friends on FB. Then when 16, I traveled to an away football match where I saw him in the away crowd leaving the ground after the game. It was so strange. The next year, when I was 17, I was watching festival highlights on YouTube when there he was in the middle of a song shown on the TV footage.
That's kind of wild. Running into a friend from a cruise years later at a football match is random enough. Then seeing him pop up in festival footage just adds to it. It's like the universe keeps throwing him back into your life. I guess sometimes people just cross paths in unexpected ways, even if you don't really connect anymore. It's a small world, I guess.
My dad was walking in the mountains around where I live. After a few hours out there, he finds a wallet on the ground, looks inside to see the ID. The owner of the wallet turns out to be a dude my dad worked with about 20 years ago. Anyways, he carries on walking, not thinking much of it other than an interesting coincidence. After a couple of hours walking, he hears a Land Rover 4x4 driving on the mountain. The Land Rover pulls up next to my dad, and who should be the driver but the owner of the wallet my dad had picked up a few hours ago. The guy he'd worked with 20 years ago. Hadn't seen him in almost as long. So Dad hands over the wallet to the bemusement of his old friend who wasn't up there looking for it and had lost it up there over 6 months previously. What are the chances,
That's a pretty wild coincidence. Just imagine being up in the mountains, finding a wallet, and then running into the owner hours later. It's one of those moments that feels like fate or something. I mean, losing a wallet for months and then getting it back from an old friend in such a random place is definitely a memorable mix of luck and nostalgia. Just shows how small the world can be, you know?
I was walking my poodle in Forest Park in Portland, Oregon, when I met another poodle owner. In the course of our rambling conversation, I asked the woman where she had gotten her poodle. Well, you wouldn't know her. She lives way up off in northern New Hampshire. The woman said, "I know Charlene," was my immediate reply, and I was right. I was at a party at Charlene's house a couple years earlier. We won the prize for longest trip, and I had met the parents of the dog now in front of me.
That's a neat coincidence. It's funny how small connections can happen. Meeting someone who knows the same person can really make a casual encounter feel special. Poodles must have a great network. It probably made the walk more memorable, sharing stories about Charlene and the dogs. Just goes to show, you never know who you might run into while out and about. Life has its little surprises, doesn't it?
In my gap year, I worked in a large library in the UK with a woman who wore incredibly stinky and unpleasant hippie perfume. I would smell her about 2 minutes before I saw her appear, at which point she would say, "Aw, hello," in a really vague and dreamy hippie voice. 5 years later, I had moved abroad to a small city in France. I smelled her about 2 minutes before I saw her appearing one day, thinking to myself, surely not. It can't be. And suddenly there she was, saying, "Oh, bonjour," in a really vague and dreamy hippie voice with a terrible French accent. Not a life-changing coincidence, but it has always made me smile.
That's kind of funny how scents can bring back memories. Running into someone like that years later, especially in a different country, is unexpected. It's cool she stayed true to her vibe. Must have felt a bit like a déjà vu moment. Just goes to show how small the world can be sometimes, even if it's just an amusing encounter.
My family and I went to the Rainforest Cafe near Disney World in Orlando, Florida, and by total coincidence, ran into my uncle with his family at the same restaurant. As my family was waiting to be seated, my mom saw my uncle talking to the hostess and said, "Wow, that guy looks like my brother. Holy shit." We lived about an hour and a half from Orlando, and my uncle lived about 4 or 5 hours away.
That's funny how you can run into family like that. It's a small world, especially in places like Disney. I can imagine the surprise when your mom realized who it was. Definitely a memorable moment for everyone involved. Families can be everywhere without us even knowing it. It's nice when those random encounters happen while on a trip. Makes the experience a little more special.
Honeymoon was at Disney World. We walked to Epcot the first night, and my husband remembered to tell me that a coworker was there to propose to his girlfriend, but the likelihood of us seeing him was low. As he finished those words, we hear, "Hey." And there they were. Hadn't proposed yet. We chatted and carried on. Later that week, we went to a restaurant reservation early, and they seated us next to them. We ended up getting drinks on the boardwalk. Fun times. She said yes.
That's kind of funny how things work out. Just walking around Disney World and running into people you know. It's cool that you got to hang out with them too. The whole proposal thing adds a nice touch to the trip. Just good vibes all around. Glad they said yes though. Sounds like a memorable honeymoon.
So I grew up in Ohio and moved to Texas for a job. In order to make friends, I joined a meetup group. At one of the events, a girl mentions how she was going back to Ohio to visit her family. So I asked her where. She mentions a big city. So I say I grew up in one of its suburbs. Well, she was from that same suburb. Did you go to School X? Yes, I did. She asked me if I knew so-and-so. He was my best friend. Then we found out I had played piano at her wedding when she married my best friend's brother, who she then later divorced. So it was a little awkward after we figured it all out.
That's a pretty wild coincidence. Seems like small worlds can lead to some funny moments. It's always surprising how connections just pop up like that, especially in a new place. A little awkwardness is normal, though. At least you have that shared history to bond over, even if it comes with a bit of baggage. It's interesting how life ties people together in unexpected ways.
During the school year, our English teacher brought some lovely Californian ladies from a nearby school. They were studying abroad for a few weeks. For us to speak with, were French. We had a blast, invited them to the bar afterwards, and it was a great night for all parties involved. And 6 months later, while I'm in London with my family for the vacations, I see someone I think I know. I ask Sage. She turns, and she was the American girl I talked the most with on vacation here with her family too, and she happened to be in the same exact Londonian street the exact same day. So yeah, I guess it's a small world.
That sounds like a nice experience. Meeting someone unexpectedly like that can be a cool surprise. It's interesting how connections can happen across different places. It's a reminder that the world isn't as big as it seems sometimes. You never know when you'll bump into someone you met before, especially when you're far from home. Just goes to show how those moments can stick with you.
I left Albuquerque, New Mexico, for Jerusalem, as in Israel. Needed an apartment and was worried that my Hebrew was not going to be good enough to negotiate. Found a listing at my college and checked it out. I knew the landlord. She'd lived in Albuquerque for many years. I rented from here and spent a fabulous year in the old city of Jerusalem. From the roof deck, we could see the Dome of the Rock and the Herva Arch, since rebuilt. Amazing year.
That sounds cool. It must have been interesting adjusting to a new place, especially with the language barrier. Finding a familiar face in a foreign city probably helped a lot. Having a view of the Dome of the Rock must have been something special. It's nice to hear you enjoyed your year there. That's a unique experience not many get to have.
I've got two. Met a family in France, and turned out we not only lived in the same city, but the same road back home. Made friends with a guy in China. Then one day, I was drinking at a friend's house back in the UK, and someone knocked on the window. Turns out it was the guy from China who now studies at the same uni as me, and saw me through the window as he was walking back home to the flat next door.
That's a pretty wild coincidence. Connecting with people from different places is always interesting. It's funny how life brings you back together with someone in such unexpected ways. Just shows how small the world can be sometimes, especially when you end up in the same spot after crossing paths in different countries. Makes you think about all the connections we have out there.
I was at a TV show taping in Los Angeles and struck up conversation with a man next to me in line. Skipping how we arrived at it, we ultimately learned that we both grew up in the same city 3,000 miles away on the same street, 2 houses apart. Our 15-year age difference is why we never knew each other at the time.
That's a wild coincidence. Meeting someone from your past in such a random place is kind of surreal. It's interesting how life can connect people from different times and places. Makes you think about the small world we live in.
When I was in high school, I went to see a local band play a free event. I was 15. Now 23, I met a guy not too long ago that I instantly sort of connected with and spent a lot of time talking about his music. Turns out, he was the same guitarist I'd seen at that local show 8 years ago. In an even weirder twist of fate, I've now got a degree in music and am teaching in music theory.
That's a cool story. It's funny how life works out sometimes. You see someone perform when you're young, and later on, you end up in a position to teach them. Kind of a full circle moment. Makes you think about how small the world really is and how those early experiences shape us. Nice that you're now sharing your knowledge with someone who inspired you back then.
Was in Air Force basic training in 2009. Was within the first 2 weeks of training. Our brother flight's TI was in our dorm assisting with inspections. Let's call him SGDT. As they're going from bunk to bunk, SGDT is asking everybody where they are from and eventually gets to me. He asks, I answer I'm from Delaware. He replies, I'm from Delaware. What part? I answer the town I'm from, and of course he says, I'm from town name. At this point, it's already crazy enough that we are from the same state. He continues on to ask, we're in town name, and I reply with a neighborhood. Lo and behold, he is from the exact same neighborhood. Turns out his wife and daughter lived less than a quarter mile behind me. In case anyone is wondering, his wife is also AF and was stationed at the local military installation. SGDT was on his 3rd tour of being a TI and just travels to San Antonio to push flights, then goes back home in between.
That's wild how small the world can be. You think you're just starting basic training, and then you meet someone from your own town. It's always surprising when you find those connections out of nowhere, especially in a place like that. Makes the experience feel a bit more personal, right? Just goes to show you never know who you might run into or what shared experiences you might have.
I was vacationing in Japan, visiting some relatives. I'm from Southern California. Told my cousin that I had to pee, walked into a coffee shop, Starbucks equivalent. Person standing in line is friend who lives 3 miles away from me in California. Had no idea he was in Tokyo. Tokyo. So many people. Pretty sure his brain exploded when I tapped his shoulder.
That's a wild coincidence. You're just trying to handle business, and then you bump into someone from home in such a random place. I get it, Tokyo is huge, yet somehow you both land in the same spot. Must have been a surreal moment for both of you. Small world, I guess. Definitely a story to tell later about your trip.
A bit late to the party, but here goes. Back in middle school, I was great friends with a guy called Billy. Went to the same church. Went to college and met a guy called Frank who knew Billy, who went to the same high school. Me and Frank became great friends. Hit on a cute girl at the cafeteria, and she brought me back to her place to meet her roommates. One roommate was named Sandra. We all became good friends. One night, Sandra was Skyping a friend from high school who went to awesome college. Her friend said, "Hey, I have to go do something. Here, talk to my friend." She hears a voice that says, "Hey, do you happen to know 2 people called Lingo Lee and Frank?" It was Billy. Mind blown.
That's a wild coincidence. It's funny how small the world can be. You casually connect with someone through different paths, and suddenly there's this unexpected link to your past. Makes you think about all the random connections we have. It's reassuring in a way, how we cross paths with the same people without even realizing it. Life can throw some surprising moments at you.
I went on a family trip to Florida once. Just so happened my friend was going to the same town at the same time, spring break, so we were to hang out when we got there. Lucky coincidence working in our favor, right? We were staying with an old friend of the family, essentially a third grandma for me. He's staying with his aunt. I call him for the address where he's staying. He tells me. I ask Mimi how far that is from her house. She kind of chuckles and says, "Oh, right across the street." I tell my buddy to walk outside. Sure enough, there he is.
That's pretty cool how things lined up. It's nice when plans just fall into place like that. Having a friend so close by makes a trip more enjoyable. Seeing someone you know unexpectedly can really boost the vibe of a family trip. Plus, staying with someone familiar adds a nice touch to the experience. Easy moments like that stick with you. Just hanging out and enjoying the time together was probably the best part.
This happened to a guy my dad knew. The guy was in another country, I don't remember where, and his cab driver asked him where he was from. When he said Los Angeles, the driver said that he knew someone from LA and asked if he knew her. It turned out that she was his next-door neighbor and one of his best friends as a kid.
That's a pretty interesting coincidence. It's wild how small the world can be sometimes. You travel all the way to another country and end up connecting over something so local. I guess it just shows that you never know who you might run into or what ties people have, even if they're miles apart. Just goes to show how interconnected everyone really is.
I live in a big metropolitan city in the States. I was in a small city in Sweden at a party with friends. Started talking with this girl. Found out she was a foreign exchange student. She had stayed in my town with a family that I knew. That family had the star high school baseball player on it, and our high school had gone to state championship. The game was played at a large major league baseball stadium. She had gone to that game, as had I.
That's a pretty interesting connection. Running into someone from a different country who has ties to your hometown can be a bit surreal. It's funny how small the world gets when you find those common experiences, like sharing memories of a high school championship game. It kind of makes you think about the random paths life takes us on and who we might end up meeting along the way.
While studying in California, my brother, who had moved there from Greece, dated a girl from Peru. He moved back to Greece 2 years later. One day, he had dinner with a Greek friend of his who has never lived in the U.S., only to find out that his friend was marrying his Peruvian ex-girlfriend's sister.
That's a strange coincidence. It's wild how small the world can be sometimes, especially when you find connections like that. Your brother probably didn't see that coming at all. Makes you think about how everyone is somehow linked, even if they're from different places. Imagine the conversations they had during that dinner. Just a reminder that life throws some interesting surprises our way.
A friend of mine is from rural Ohio and lives in Boston. She came to visit me, NYC, around Christmas 2 years ago, and I was showing her around. We stopped by the 34th Street Macy's and are looking at the decorations and such, and she runs in her third grade teacher for middle grammar school. She just happened to be visiting from her hometown and was looking at Macy's as well. Small world. Edit word.
That's a cool story. Running into an old teacher like that must have been surprising for her. It's funny how small the world feels sometimes, especially in a big city like New York. Just shows you never really know who you'll meet when you're out and about. The holiday season always brings people together, too. It's nice they could share that moment.
Please consider subscribing if you enjoyed. Love.